Good morning. Welcome to Sport Resolution's seminar entitled The Road to Tokyo 2021, How to Manage Athlete Selection, which is brought to you in association with my chambers 4 New Square and the British Athletes Commission. My name is Daniel Saoul and I'm one of your speakers today. As you know, we are in unprecedented times, creating significant headaches for sport governing bodies so far as selection, amongst many other things, is concerned. With selection policies having been developed specifically for the Tokyo Games that was due to take place this summer, the big question is, what do we do now? And that is a question faced by both athletes and the governing bodies. We have no idea what the competition schedule is going to look like in the coming months, nor what sort of condition our athletes might be in when the games roll around next year, nor indeed do we know what the games will really look like. This seminar aims to consider some of those issues, as well as to discuss general principles relevant to good selection that should apply whether you are in times of crisis or not. By way of introduction, you have two speakers today. I will be speaking to you first, and I will be addressing broader points of principle and some of the legal issues that should guide a selection process and also guide the response to the current situation. I'll be looking at how one drafts a selection policy, what they should contain, good practice in terms of how the selection process should be run, and some considerations regarding appeals, as well as some specific issues arising out of the COVID-19 crisis. In terms of my background, I'm a barrister practicing in sports law, public law, and commercial disputes. And my experience in sports law is broad, and so far as selection is concerned, I've drafted and advised on many selection policies. I've represented athletes and also governing bodies and appeals. I've chaired selection panels, including for London in 2012, and I've also chaired appeal tribunals. Before I trained as a lawyer, I was involved in rowing at the elite level as a competitor coach and also on the governance side. Your second speaker today is Sam Little, who is Head of Athlete Support for the British Athletes Commission. As many of you will no doubt know, the BAC exists to support, represent and empower Great Britain's elite athletes, and it provides independent and confidential advice to its members, and Sam will be explaining some of that more to you later. As Head of Athlete Support, Sam and her team are at the forefront of the BAC's work, and a significant part of her role is supporting athletes who are dealing with selection issues. Sam has an impressive pedigree, and before joining the BAC a couple of years ago, spent more than 22 years in the army, is extensively experienced in HR issues, and is a qualified workplace mediator, and she's used those skills both in the military and in high performance sport. Now, we plan to take questions at the end. Please use the Q&A feature to log your questions as we go along, and then we will deal with them at the end. We both plan to speak for between 20 and 30 minutes, and there'll be a decent slot for questions at the end. I'll be turning to my next slide now. Now, before I start on any points of detail, I want to make two overarching points. The first is that I'm conscious that much of what I will be saying will sound like it's directed to, and in many ways is directed to, the governing bodies. And that's obviously somewhat inevitable because they are the ones in control of these processes. However, I am conscious, and it is a fact, that there are many other stakeholders, not least the athletes, but also coaching staff, other entities such as the funding bodies, and of course fans and the general public. And I'm well aware that people joining this webinar today will come from a variety of backgrounds and will include lawyers advising a variety of different parties. And I'm hoping that what I'll have to say will be of interest to all, because what is, as I will explain, what is good for a governing body and what is good for an athlete is the same thing. And that is the second point I want to make as a general point, that it is important, especially for governing bodies, but also for the athletes, not to approach this as if it's a zero-sum or adversarial exercise, and or indeed to approach it with a defensive mindset. It's clear to me, and this arises again and again, that what is good practice in the selection process it is both good for athletes and good for the governing bodies. And that is consistently the case. And governing bodies should have nothing to hide by embracing the principles of transparency and other principles I'm about to explain. So I'm going to now address you first on the core principles which permeate the selection process, because they should guide everything a governing body does. They should guide the questions that athletes should be asking, and above all, they should be guiding governing bodies' response to the current predicament that they face. So I'm going to turn to my next slide now. And let's start by asking ourselves and reminding ourselves what the objectives of a good selection policy are. And this may seem a little bit basic, but it's important not to overlook, because when you look at these points, it's immediately clear that everyone will agree on them. Clearly, you want to select the best team or best athletes possible. Now, what exactly that may mean may depend on the event, but the concept is not controversial and no one will disagree with it. You want to do it fairly. Again, that sounds basic, but it's so important. And again, no one can disagree with this principle. And the third point, which is important not to overlook, is to do this humanely. And what I mean by that is how you handle people who are involved in the process, and in particular, those who are going to be affected by the decisions. And that is primarily the athletes, but also the coaches, whose decisions and performance directors and others whose decisions may stand to be criticized after the event. This is not the poor relative of the other 2 points. And if the process is handled well, if people are dealt with in a proper and genuine way, then the risk that governing bodies face when they are navigating the selection process and the risk of appeals will be massively reduced. I cannot overstate this. Sam will be addressing some of these points later on, but it really is crucial. And there is a point here which is unspoken, which isn't on the slide, but which is apparent to everyone, and it is the harsh reality that in selection, not everyone can get picked. And there is no getting around that, and no matter what you do as a governing body or what position you are in as an athlete, that is not something that can be changed, and everyone understands that. So what governing bodies have got to do is ensure that when athletes don't get the decision that they would like, which will happen, they recognize that that is just how the competitive environment works. They recognize that the decision was taken legitimately. That is the goal you're looking to achieve. And that is what approaching things properly and fairly will achieve. I'll turn to my next slide now, please. So what are the key principles of a fair process? And these should transcend every step of the process. Point 1, generally apply the policy that you've developed. And I think everyone now does recognize the need to have a selection policy in the first place. Respect the policy. That will obviously apply in usual circumstances. And I recognize that when we are dealing with exceptional circumstances, respecting the policy may not be an option. And I'll cover that later. The second step is governing bodies have got to act reasonably in all that they do. That means not irrationally, not in a matter that's arbitrary or capricious or doing things because of personal preferences. Now remember, this is a wide bandwidth that governing bodies and selectors have. It is not tribunals in appeals who are checking this are not looking for minor transgressions or to see whether they could have done it better. Reasonableness is broad, but that doesn't mean that it can be ignored. Taking decisions on a sound factual basis, again, this seems obvious, but there is so much data now in sport, as we all know, that it is important that at least the important data is checked before it is relied upon. So the facts must be right that you are about to take your decision on the basis of. No bias and no appearance of bias. Now, I think most people will understand what bias means. Appearance of bias is something slightly more difficult to grasp. But the definition of this is that it is whether a reasonable person might conclude that it appeared that there was a real danger of bias. And all of these tests require governing bodies or those involved in the selection process to stand back and really ask themselves tough questions about whether someone reasonable looking from the outside could form the view that there might be bias here. Even if there wasn't actually bias, could someone reasonable looking in think that there might be bias? Now, sometimes, obviously, this is unavoidable because, for example, there may be people on the selection panel who coach athletes who are candidates for selection. And in those situations, you've just got to manage it as best you can, including, for example, asking those people not to vote, if that's appropriate. But make sure that's followed through. And let me give you an example of what I mean. I've been involved in a case. I was involved as a selection, as a tribunal panel member in an appeal, where a coach was involved, a selection panel member was a coach of an athlete who was up for selection and didn't vote on whether that athlete should or should not be selected for the London Games. Now, that seems sensible. The problem was that when they came to be considering the primary competitor for that athlete's place, that person did vote, and they voted against that individual being selected. Now, that may seem an obvious error in hindsight, but that was a very experienced selection panel that did that, and they defended the decision in the appeal. And plainly, it was completely indefensible. So you've just got to make sure that you follow through your decisions on conflicts and possible bias so that it doesn't creep in around the back door. Finally, considering all relevant factors and nothing irrelevant is straightforward in theory at least, and then respecting legitimate expectations. This means that where an athlete has been led to believe in advance that things will be done in a particular way, then you should generally be respecting that, unless there is a very good reason notified in advance not to do so. And I should say here, be careful if you are a governing body about what is said to athletes about how the selection process will be carried out or what really matters. Coaches should not be having conversations like that with athletes that say anything other than what the selection policy says, unless they genuinely intend to be held to something else other than what is in the policy. And if that is the governing body's intention, fine, but put it down in writing and notify all relevant athletes of the position. Otherwise, you could find yourselves in hot water, and there have been appeals on this basis, where an athlete feels that they've been told, don't worry about such and such an event, focus on this other event, and if you do well there, you'll get selected. And then, of course, they don't get selected because the selection panel, when it comes to it, is following the policy, which says something different. Now, these are the guiding principles that, in my view at least, as a lawyer who's looked at these issues for a number of years, should guide everything you do. And when you are considering what seems to be a difficult question on selection, if you come back to these principles and do your best to respect them, it is very unlikely that you will go wrong. I'll go on to my next slide now. So, I'm sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? I think there's been a slip here in my slide, which I'll take responsibility for, but I want to make some points for you on the drafting of the selection policy. And I can make sure the slide here that I've omitted to include is circulated. So drafting the selection policy. The first point is that there is no magic to drafting your selection policy, okay? It's obviously a very sport-specific piece of work. The most important thing is that your policy is clear. And that sounds, again, straightforward, but there have been many examples of policies drafted by people who are in the inner circle, the coaches, the performance directors, the selectors, who know what they're trying to achieve and who are well-intentioned, but because they know what they are trying to achieve, when they come to write it down, it assumes a great deal of things. Test the clarity of your policy by getting someone who has nothing to do with your selection process to read it, and who knows, and ideally who knows nothing about your sport to read it, so that you can test whether it actually does say what you mean. Now, there are a number of bases that you will want to make sure are covered, such as what event you are selecting for, how many places are available, and what, if that depends on a number of factors, for example, qualifying places and so on and so forth, making that clear. What the overall objective of the selection policy is. Is it, for example, to select the best team, or is it to select people for development purposes, or is it something else altogether? What are the eligibility requirements for the athletes? You need to set that out. For example, nationality issues, age requirements, any gender requirements or anything else. You will want to identify who the selection panel is, who is voting, who is non-voting, whether you will be having independent people in the room, whether you can invite people who aren't actually members of the selection panel, but who are experts in an area to contribute, such as a medical expert or a team doctor who can come in and provide you with input on those sorts of issues. Most importantly, you'll want to identify your selection criteria. And these may include objective factors, such as performances in time trials or speed tests or something similar, or indeed performances in events where that performance can be measured and objectively verified. And there may also be subjective factors, such as selectors' opinions on an athlete's mental attitude, how they would fit into a team, their technique. And some factors obviously are inevitably going to be a mix of the two, such as an athlete's performance trajectory, where there will be data, but there needs to be interpretation on top of that. Now, in my experience, athletes tend to prefer the criteria to be as objective as possible, because then the decision is less discretionary and not so much in the hands of the performance director and coaches. And vice versa, coaches and performance directors naturally tend to prefer if the decision is left entirely up to them, such that their discretion is unfettered. The bottom line here is that you've got to take into account all relevant factors. You can't just pick and choose. And so often it will have to be a mix of objective and subjective factors, and it will all be very sport specific. The key point is, though, whatever you decide, make it very clear what the position is. And to the extent that some aspects are discretionary, there is no point in sugarcoating that feature. My recommendation is to recognize that in the policy up front, that those aspects involve a matter of expert judgment. Recognize that the panel is going to seek to exercise its judgment in a reasonable way, in accordance with the guiding principles I mentioned earlier, and that it will do so also in a rational way and unbiased way. And that way, everyone knows what the deal is. That there is a part that is subjective and a matter of judgment, but equally, the panel will be required to exercise that judgment in a reasonable and unbiased way. And that, of course, is what the law also requires. So there's no point shying away from that. It's also really helpful for governing bodies, this, because if it comes to an appeal, and if the issue ultimately is whether that subjective judgment was exercised fairly, the tribunal will understand, the appeal tribunal will understand straight away that that limb of the decision-making process, it is a sport-specific limb, it requires expertise in the sport, and is an area where the appeal panel is going to confer on the selectors a wide degree of latitude. So signaling these things very transparently and clearly is a good idea. The other features that you should include in a selection policy include what happens in relation to deselection and what are the criteria for deselection. For example, if there's an injury or loss of form or a breach of a disciplinary regulation, such as an anti-doping violation. And also you should include an appeals process, and I will explain a bit more about that later. Two final features on how the process should be put together. One, consult with athletes. It is a strong recommendation, and Sam will address you on this more later. But consulting on important policies in advance, circulating them in draft form, is just good governance. It gets athletes buy-in, it gets other stakeholders buy-in. And it's also important because it then becomes much harder for an athlete a year down the road to say that the policy is unfair if they've been consulted on it and not had any comment. So it's good for everyone. And that is another classic example of how what is good for athletes in terms of consultation is also good for governing bodies. And the final thing is that it's important to publish the policy as far in advance as possible so that people know what they have to do to get selected. Next slide, please. So in terms of the running of the process, quite simply, this is an exercise in good governance and good administration, and this applies equally to how you respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And the points there reflect really what I've already said, but step by step, make sure your data is accurate, make sure you've managed any conflicts or potential bias in advance. You should give strong consideration to having an independent observer or independent lawyer there. That gives legitimacy to the process in a number of ways. It gives comfort to those who aren't in the room that the process is transparent and fair. And it also, by the same token, makes sure that the governing body and selection panel members are doing their job properly, and it keeps them on point. Now, it's not a complete cure for appeals, but it is extra comfort for everybody. Now, when you are discussing selections, and this is a really important point that I think is not often done, even at the highest level, be thorough and searching in your debate in the meeting as to who should and shouldn't be selected, just as when you are considering now what to do in response to COVID-19, be thorough and searching in what you're thinking about and the issues you are discussing amongst yourselves and what the implications are. And let me give you an example. When you are discussing even the lead athlete, who is an obvious shoo-in for selection in the selection panel's view, ask yourself, and ask it out loud and record it in the minutes. Are there reasons not to select this person? What are the downsides of selecting this person? What about this other person? It may seem obvious, and in many cases that doesn't need to be a long conversation, but it really is important to check and challenge. And often that will be the chair's role more than anyone else, but I would encourage all selection panel members to check and challenge. The more you do that, the more robust and reliable your decision will be. And minute all of this as fully as you can. Now, I appreciate that minuting things thoroughly is not always easy to do, but recognize that typically the minutes are going to be the only record of the reasoning that resulted in the decision. And otherwise, it's going to be just the word of the selection panel members as to what went on. You want the minutes to be comprehensive and to be available if and when an appeal arises. And let me give you an example. I chaired a selection panel in London 2012, and I tried to make my minutes as thorough as I could. And there were appeals. It's not going to prevent appeals, but the minutes in the end were so comprehensive, and maybe here being a trained lawyer does help, but got to the point where the allegation made by some of the appellants was that the minutes had been forged after the event, believe it or not, because the selection panel discussion could not possibly, it was said, be as thorough as it in fact was. Now, if you're in a place where you're being accused of forging minutes, and I assume you're not going to be forging minutes, then that you are in a good place. And I appreciate that for those involved at the sharp end, it's going to feel quite tiresome to be told by a lawyer to record everything properly. But this isn't about wanting to create paper or wanting everyone to be a lawyer. This is about good governance. And in any area, where people in positions of power are taking decisions that have a massive effect or potentially massive effect on people's lives. Proper governance just requires this sort of minuting. And finally, be consistent in how you treat all athletes. Don't be searching and check and challenge with one athlete selection, but not with another, because that will quickly become apparent in minutes. I'll move on to my next slide now, please. Now, appeals. It is important to have an appeals procedure, and this is in everybody's interests. And if you don't have one, there will be serious downsides for a governing body's perspective, and it's not good for the athletes either. Why? First, because not having an appeals policy will drive challenges to the High Court. Now, some people may take the view, well, the athletes won't have the appetite or the financial resources for a High Court challenge. But I would caution against that view for two reasons. The first is, fundamentally, that is not a fair way to approach things. Trying to stifle an appeal by putting people in a position where they can't afford to appeal is not good governance. And the second point is, some athletes do have the resources or the commitment to go to the High Court. And anyone who's familiar with the history of this area knows that the British Athletics Federation was bankrupted by such a challenge. And that's indeed why, one of the reasons why Sport Resolutions was created. So I strongly recommend that you write in an arbitration procedure. It doesn't need to be complicated. The appeal body should be completely independent from the sport and from those who took the selection decision. And in my view, should also be legally qualified. And both of those things are important in terms of the robustness of the appeal process and how the governing body's perceived. You want the athlete to feel that they're getting a fair hearing. So being defensive or choosing in-house people is not a good idea. If you do that, you then again risk another High Court challenge on the basis that your appeal process is no good. And frankly, from a governing body's perspective, if there has been unfairness, if there has been an error, we as the governing bodies, if we're acting for them, want that to be uncovered, just as we, if we're acting for the athletes, want that to be uncovered, and the general public wants that to be uncovered. So governing bodies like athletes should welcome independent scrutiny. And whilst I appreciate it's never comfortable to have your decisions raked over by an independent lawyer, comfort is not the relevant test. And transparency is important. And here you will want to be able to provide the minutes to appealing athletes. If they, you're entitled to ask them to treat them as confidential. And of course you can redact contents of the minutes that are both irrelevant and sensitive to other athletes. I want to emphasize here that the appeal panel will not have jurisdiction to make its own mind up as to who should be selected. That is not the appeal panel's job. It will recognize that the experts on the selection panel are the experts on technical matters. What the appeal panel is there for is to invigilate compliance with the core principles, reasonableness, lack of bias, factual mistakes, and so on. And one last point on appeals, which is that some governing bodies, I'm conscious, are advised to state in their appeal procedure that the only possible ground of appeal to an athlete is if the selection procedure, selection policy has not been followed. I don't recommend that you say that because it's not the law. The law is that if your decision is unreasonable in any way or biased, it's also capable of challenge. And also if there's been a material factual mistake, then it's also capable of challenge. So it doesn't benefit anyone to misstate what the legal position actually is. It risks misleading athletes about what their rights are, and it risks also misleading the selection panel about what the relevant criteria for an appeal are and what they need to make sure they're doing correctly. So there's no point in describing things in a sort of wrongly narrow way. And I make clear here that even the subjective decisions, even the discretionary judgment calls should be capable of challenge, but again, only up to the extent that they're unreasonable or based on a factual error. I'll turn to my next slide now, please. So against this background, the $64,000 question, what should governing bodies be doing now in light of the current crisis? And I recognize the real difficulties this creates. We're in a position where our selection policies are effectively stale or redundant to a large extent. We don't know, we're not in a position yet, if we're governing bodies, to rewrite policies because we don't know what the competition schedule will look like. Athletes aren't in a position to know what they might be required to do. At the same time, we have policies that are published, and governing bodies may well think, well, should I be respecting those regardless of what's going on now? The bottom line here, and I appreciate this is not necessarily what people want to hear, but there is no perfect solution right now. And the right thing to do, in my personal opinion, is to recognize that and to be upfront about that and to be transparent about that. If you follow the core principles of reasonableness in what you're doing, of transparency, of engaging with stakeholders, it becomes very difficult to go wrong. And I think being upfront with athletes, that you are consulting on this, that you are considering what to do, seek their views. The reality is that by the time you end up with an alternative mechanism, as things develop, you will want to have athletes buy in on that. You do not want to have a challenge in 3, 6, 9, 12 months' time that the way that the governing body behaved in response to all of this was a massive fiasco. So operate transparently, communicate, and check constantly with your boards and with those sounding boards that are available to you, that what you're doing broadly sounds reasonable. Because if you're doing that, and if you're considering and bottoming out the alternatives, it will become very difficult to criticize what you're doing. I should be clear, I don't think we are now in a situation where governing bodies are going to be required to respect policies that they wrote in very different circumstances and without any idea of what was to come now. What matters is approaching the change of course now in a way that allows athletes to change their behavior in advance and that brings athletes with them to avoid difficulties down the road. The last point on this is one specific point, which is that I think I would recommend caution about using deselection clauses in existing policies as the way to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. It doesn't seem to me that deselection clauses were drafted with this in mind. And I personally think it would be better and clearer for everybody if whatever policy is adopted is something fresh that sets a clear path forward, rather than trying to do it all through the mechanism of a deselection clause, which never anticipated the circumstances we're now in. I will now pass you over to Sam, who will give you the BAC's perspective.
Thank you, Dan. I'm hoping to provide you with an athlete perspective on selection, which I hope is relevant to you wherever you sit in the high performance sport system, wherever you are national governing bodies, as well as many legal advisors as well. Next slide, please. The basis of my perspective really is from the work undertaken by the BAC in its role in providing independent, confidential support to around 1,200 Great Britain, UK sport funded athletes and across 40 plus Olympic and Paralympic sports. Next slide, please. And as you can see from this slide, the BAC does provide a range of support to athletes on a really varied range of athlete-centered issues. But I would say that from experience that program and event selection is very much at the heart of what we're delivering in terms of support. But I would also say that program and event selection doesn't sit in isolation from the others, and from experience that many of our athletes that come forward for support around program and event selection inevitably lead to a multidisciplinary case that we need to support, and there will be impact inevitably on an athlete's mental health and well-being. There may well be implications to commercial contracts and more general welfare issues. Next slide, please. What I hope to highlight to you in this slide is really to try and consider a balance of proactive and reactive considerations to selection. I think more often than not, athletes find themselves very much in the reactionary space in selection terms. And I would suggest to you that we need to try and readdress that balance and allow athletes to become much more proactive and actively engaged and involved in the complete selection process. I'm going to focus on 4 key areas which effectively mirror the selection process that Dan has covered in terms of a timeline. I think this perspective, again, reflects best practice out there from many sports, as well as lessons that we've, as an organisation, have identified over a wide range of individual cases that we've supported. And I would also refer you to the UK Sport BOA BPA selection guide process, which is still very relevant today as it was drafted fairly recently in the last 12 months. So starting at the beginning of the process, and I think it's particularly relevant today when we find ourselves in these unprecedented times that may require many sports to reconsider, revise, add addendums to their current selection policies. Consultation and engagement with athletes is a really key part of selection activities. And we know from talking to athletes that engagement with them is really important to them. And if I can refer you to the Duty of Care report by Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson, and particularly theme 3 in the report, she talks in detail about the representation of the participant's voice. And the Code for Sport Governance stresses the importance of listening to and meaningfully consideration to stakeholders, and in this case, athletes being a very key stakeholder in the process. And I think consultation and engagement, without doubt, builds trust, earns respect, and empowers athletes. I know that many of you may well have a very different perspective of this view, because I know that many of you will feel that engagement and consultation won't bring consensus, that it may well make decision making very difficult. It won't stop an athlete appealing, and it may well not stand as a point in arbitration to try and justify your position. But as Daniel has referred, it's about good governance, and it's about making sure that you have buy-in from all the stakeholders, importantly athletes, in this process. In practical terms, considering how you might consult with athletes, I think many of you have got well-developed athlete rep networks. Many of you have got board members who are current and recently retired athletes, and I think they can and are actively involved and in a good place to consult and engage with your athletes. You may wish to also consider adding an additional layer of independence to that consultation, and certainly the BAC in the last 12 months has been actively involved in supporting athlete reps, athlete board members, performance directors in that consultation process. And I would suggest that in your consideration about how you consult and engage, there is a huge difference in athletes within sports and across sports. And if we just take even within sports, the age difference between athletes can obviously have a real difference about how they communicate and information. And I would stress to you that you need to consider whether you're getting best consultation out of your athletes, particularly in this digital and virtual world that we now find ourselves in. There's huge differences between intellectual capacity and also learning difficulties that many of our athletes do have. So we do need to think about how do we get the best out of them in that consultation process. And in practical terms, we found that workshops led by performance directors, key leadership staff, have been really well received by athletes and demonstrate a significant level of buy-in and a sort of contract between the athlete and those performance staff. And again, practically, we certainly as a BAC have found using some pictogram style communications really helpful with our consultation. And we've done some quite meaty consultations recently around return to training and Rule 40 and trying to just bring some of those really complex issues into really simplistic pictorial terms is really helpful for athlete consultation and engagement. So moving on to education, again, from recent experience early on in the year when we were travelling towards a Tokyo this summer, I think it would be fair to say from our experience with the athletes that we met and spoke to around selection, that the understanding and knowledge of selection policies and procedures is pretty low. Some of you may feel that's down to athlete naivety and that they should take ownership for that knowledge, but I would also counter that with that many of the policies are incredibly complex and very legalistic in nature, and I think somewhere we need to find a sweet spot that allows athletes to look at a policy and find it to be user and athlete friendly. I think providing education to your athletes demonstrates a high degree of transparency. I also firmly believe that it will help you aim off problems further down the line. Many of the requests that we receive at the BAC are based on what I would say is poor athlete awareness around selection policies and procedures. Athletes are often incredibly surprised at the narrow criteria at which they can bring an appeal. So I think when you deliver your education and training to your athletes, the key headlines that you need to get across to them are, what are the key policies that are relevant to them? Where are they? What are the timelines involved in terms of discussing that decision and perhaps raising a challenge to that decision? And I think really importantly, where is the support? What is the support that an athlete can have around a selection decision? Do consider the accessibility of your education and training. Relevant again, what is the intellectual capacity of your athletes? Are there any learning difficulties to consider in delivering that education and training? I think many people feel very fearful about signposting for support, and they fear that there may well be a challenge, that support will direct and infuse a challenge by an athlete. I think that you've got some internal support mechanisms within your performance lifestyle team and external support mechanisms in the BAC that I think will be honest brokers in that discussion. And certainly our experience as the athlete critical friend is to make sure that we're not going to leave the athlete in a more difficult place and whipping them into and thinking that they've got great grounds for an appeal. So I do think signposting them to support where they can come and have an honest, open conversation is really important. Daniel's mentioned appeals, and I just want to cover an area around appeals in terms of fees. Some sports do levy a fee on an athlete in terms of raising an appeal. Certainly in the UK sport BOA, BPA policy guidance, it's not recommended, and it's certainly not a position that the BAC would advocate. I think levying an appeal can give a perception, real or otherwise, to providing a real barrier for an athlete to challenge, and I think drives a further wedge between the athletes and the national governing body. So moving on to decision making, I think it would be fair to say that on the whole, athletes want decision making to be fair, and that to them means that it needs to be transparent, it needs to be defendable, and it needs to have a high degree of independent oversight. Athletes accept that the consideration of objective data is at the heart of your decision making. They also accept that there needs to be subjectivity applied and experience applied, and particularly where we're talking about team sports, where the dynamics perhaps between athletes is really difficult to justify in objective data terms and requires your application of experience and subjectivity to it. But those decisions need to be able to be explainable and justifiable to the athlete. And I think the second part, a really important part of your decision making, needs to consider what I would term the handling instructions around your decision. It may require, in that case, a second set of staff, not necessarily the coaches, the performance staff that have made the decision to deselect or select somebody, particularly if you're going to consider medical inconfidence or personal sensitive data. But I would say once you've made a decision, you need to move on to asking yourselves, what is the likely impact of that decision? Does the athlete have any known mental health problems that need to be factored into the situation? And what's the immediate support going to be around that athlete? And then moving on to communication, I've talked about the need to consider known mental health problems, but I think for most athletes, this is going to be probably, if not the most difficult moment in their professional sporting career. And I think from my experience, this is where it often goes wrong and where perhaps the own goal is scored. Many athletes relate to me that it was a big shock to be deselected, particularly from a program. And yet many of them have shown me paperwork which shows that they are on some form of performance review. And there is this perception, real or otherwise, that there is a need for some honest dialogue, particularly around performance trajectories, and to close that gap between reality and perception. I think there's a need to consider a plan about how you're going to handle delivering that decision, both individually and in collective terms. And I think some sports, their best practice is to look at it on an individual basis. And they've discussed with athletes, where do you want to be when you receive this decision? How do you want to receive this decision? Who do you want to hear it from, and who do you need to be around you, supporting you when you hear that decision? And I think there's a balance to achieve between meeting those individual needs, but also being consistent. And I guess in some sports, it's around how much resource have you got to find that sweet spot between individuality and making sure that it's consistent across the plane. I think I would stress to you that the physicality of where you deliver your decision is incredibly important and something that you need to think about. Many athletes are going to leave that room in a highly distressed and visibly emotional state. And I think many of them will want you to have thought about how that feels when they need to walk out of that room, and what now will feel like a highly challenging and stressful environment that they need to walk out of. So do really try and consider where you're going to deliver that decision. And think about who. I think many sports, many individuals want other professionals with them to help deliver that decision. But think about the perception, the adversarial nature that an athlete might face in terms of walking into that room, perhaps with a performance director, a medical member of staff, performance lifestyle advisor. And if they weren't aware that what they were going in for that meeting for, to be faced with that audience, I think can feel at times incredibly threatening. So do give that some consideration. And I think in terms of delivering difficult information, we all owe it to each other to think about our own empathy in that process. And again, I'd refer you back to Tanni Gray-Thompson's report that acknowledges that coaches don't necessarily have the people skills to handle difficult conversations. We ask coaches to be many things, and I think sometimes many of them aren't equipped to handle those difficult conversations. So So do think about maybe upskilling those that are delivering those difficult decisions to make sure that they understand what it means to be empathetic, and how do you consider empathy in your role as the deliverer of that difficult decision. I think, again, from experience, many people don't hear, they don't listen. They've gone into flight mode the minute you've talked about deselection, and that flight mode has kicked in, and they've tuned you out. They've tuned you out at an important moment where you're giving them the explanation around that objective decision making. They've not heard it. And I think you may well find what you've heard just hasn't resonated one bit with an athlete. And the importance of that follow-up meeting, I think, is really critical. A follow-up with the right members of staff, the right support mechanism wrapped around the athlete, I think will be a much more effective way. And I think what you might want to look at is that in some of the sports, their selection and their appeal policies prevent that follow-up meeting from happening. And having given the initial decision, they move straight into sort of the appeal phase. Some sports I've worked with have paused that process, and I think it's had huge advantages in pressing pause to allow a sort of step back and to almost revisit that first discussion, that first meeting, that first decision point again. Because I think if you can get an athlete back into the room with the right support structure around them, when they are able to listen, when the emotion and the heat has come out, I think you will have a better chance of explaining and justifying your decision. I think you also need to get back to signposting an athlete and not being fearful that by signposting, you're automatically leading an athlete to raise an appeal or a challenge against you. I think athletes appreciate an opportunity to go somewhere safe, to let steam, to process that decision, to take out the emotion and the heat, to take some professional advice, be that through the BAC or through with our working partnership with Sports Resolutions and the pro bono legal panel that we can provide support to athletes. Allow athletes to validate the decision that you've made, allow them to check and challenge within themselves what do they want to do, what is the right thing for them in terms of moving forward. I think sometimes there feels a real rush, and I get that there is a time imperative in some of this, but there is a real rush to tell people about the decision, be that teammates and other performance staff, and as well as making press statements. I think generally athletes respect being given the time and space to go and talk to their family and their loved ones, to not be bombarded by messages from well-intended teammates and coaching staff. And I would strongly advocate to you that you work collaboratively with the athlete to think about what does that communication look like to them and to you. And I would say it's not just about a personal perspective. There's also another perspective. You know, many athletes have got commercial sponsors that are really important to them going forward. And so that communication, that external messaging around their deselection is really important to them. And I think also it's worth mentioning the team dynamic. You know, how are you going to consider supporting those selected and non-selected that are going to have to come together to work as a team? Maybe the non-selected is a travelling reserve. How are you going to support that? The challenge around that awful conversation. Who's going to broach it first? How do we discuss it? It can't remain the elephant in the room. And I think we need to help other athletes, team captains, deal with that dynamic. You've got individuals that may well be a travelling reserve who haven't been issued kit, who the terminology within your sport's quite derogatory around the reserve or the non-selected. So how are we going to support and bring all those people together? I'm going to conclude my piece now. As Dan has explained to you right at the start, I come from a military background, and in thinking about this issue around selection, I relate to something from my military career, and many of you will be aware that in the military in the past, we've had a campaign strategy about winning hearts and minds. Many of you may think it's a bit cliched, a bit of a quip. but I do strongly believe when we're looking at selection that if you can consider the heart and mind piece, that it's incredibly important. Dan and I have talked much around the mind, about that proactive activity that can bring true transparency and independence and fairness to selection. And I think if you can do that, you'll satisfy the mind of the athlete. I think in terms of the heart, at this moment in time when you deselect an athlete, they're a human being. And I think they're more than an athlete at that point. I think you have to really get amongst your empathetic skills and think about them with them at the forefront of your mind, showing empathy, developing and showing respect and trust. And I think if you can, at the moment there feels sometimes a divide and a gulf between the heart and the mind in selection. And I think if we can all work to try and bring the heart and mind perspective to selection and to athletes together, it will leave us in a much better space. That concludes Dan and my webinar to you, and in conjunction with Sports Resolutions. I'm hoping that Dan, in the moments now where I've been speaking, has managed to look through the questions that you've posed and hopefully selected some good questions. I can see there's quite a few, so I'm going to hand over to Dan and ask him to raise the first question, please.
Thank you, Sam. Just before I do that, you made me think of a couple of additional small points. One is that governing bodies expect their athletes to operate to a world-class standard. And I think really the point that I'm trying to communicate, and I think Sam is really making the same point in many ways, is that governing bodies need to approach their procedures in a world-class way as well. And in all the ways we've described. And if they do that, and if they are extremely professional in what they do, they will have no problems, and they should apply the same standards to themselves as they apply to their athletes. The second point was really just a personal anecdote, which one of Sam's comments made me think of, which was the athlete not actually hearing what they'd been told in the selection meeting, which sounds astonishing, but it really made me remember, and this is just to bring the point to life. I remember once when my late father was going in for a potentially very important medical appointment to get some test results, and I went with him. And we duly got the news we were dreading, and it was a pretty somber meeting, and we walked back to the car. And my father was a pretty intelligent man and an exceptionally good listener. I thought all of his friends thought he was a fantastic listener, probably why he had so many. And we sat down in the car, and before I drove him home, he looked at me and said, "What did the doctor say I had again?" And it was just an extraordinary moment, which just confirms that in that moment of intense stress, you don't always hear. And I think that's, it's lasted with me, that, because I would never have accepted if someone had just told me that that could be possible, but it plainly is. And I think that's especially valid here when you're talking about athletes being called up, especially on the phone potentially, to be given news. And it does need to be handled really sensitively. Now, one question we've been asked is, will you get the slides? And I think the answer to that is yes. And I will make sure I slot back in my missing slide. But let me take a couple of other questions. I'm going to try and see if I can make the system work and take two questions together. The first one is this, which I'm just clicking on, and it's which aspect of the current selection processes is most crying out for reform and why? And then I will link that with a question we've been asked here, which is, how can the system be deemed fair for athletes when the NGBs all write into their selection criteria and constitutions that they are not bound by the decision of selection appeal panels and only tasked with going back and thinking about what the panel has said? And the individual who's kindly asked this question says, my experience of probably the most overwhelming athlete win in an Olympic selection case on a panel in which I sat was that the NGB just went back and ignored the appeal decision and the athlete didn't go to the games. How can you justify this? So I've taken these two questions together because from my perspective as a lawyer, former competitor, sports fan, probably the most unsatisfactory part of this entire process is that an appeal has limited teeth. I don't think that there are many solutions to this, I have to say, but it's not quite the case, I don't think, that an appeal panel, that the most it can do is just tell the selection panel to think about what we've said. It does go a bit further than that. An appeal panel should be allowed to quash the existing selection decision. If the existing selection decision is found to be unreasonable or based on a material factual error or to be in breach of the selection policy, the appeal panel can say that decision does not stand. But it is true that generally the appeal panel's powers are then limited to asking the selection panel to take a fresh decision, bearing in mind that it must not make the same mistake again, whatever that mistake was. And that is a matter of frustration for athletes and for those like me who've represented athletes. And yes, I was a chair of an Olympic selection appeal panel where the world number one in his sport was not selected. The appeal was valid on two grounds: an error of fact and bias. And the panel went back and selected the same other individual again. Now, there isn't, unfortunately, as far as I can see, an easy answer to this, because the appeal panel, which is going to be effectively a legally qualified panel and might have people from other sports on it, isn't going to be in a position to know who the best person to select is from a technical perspective. So what do we do? Do we require a brand new selection panel to be formed containing none of the original panel members, which means, for example, no doubt that the performance director doesn't get to vote anymore, and really all the people who know about the relevant technical matters can't decide? It's a difficult one, and it's a shame that through this process we can't have a debate about it. But from my perspective, that's the most unsatisfactory aspect. I don't think it's unjustifiable. I think it's the product of a very bespoke situation. I think the more that can be done to ensure that when selection panels take decisions again, they don't stray into the same areas, the better. And if that means that certain individuals who are biased can't participate again, then that's what should be done. But I think there's an inevitable limit to what appeal panels can do. And beyond that, one just has to encourage governing bodies to approach things honestly and to be under pressure, I suspect, from those who fund them to do the right thing, and not just to take the same decision again, but to dress it up differently. I don't know if Sam has any views on this issue, because it does obviously affect athletes a lot.
Thanks, Dan. I think from my perspective, as I probably think you can understand from what I've said, I'm very passionate about the human dimension, and I think for me that's probably the area that I feel, and obviously because we're dealing with athletes that are generally unhappy with that decision, but the human dimension to selection, and I sort of go back to my point about the heart of the athlete, and I think there's an awful lot that we can do around how we treat the athlete in that very difficult moment, so that we don't score those own goals.
Now, let me pick another question.
I've pulled out a couple of I thought really useful questions, one of which is talks around, and I acknowledged in my piece, around the time window between making selections and confirming events, and I think this is probably particularly relevant to a games scenario. But someone's asked a question around what's a reasonable timeline for an appeal and for parties to be heard. And I'd be interested from your perspective legally where that is. I think from my perspective, there's probably a difference between an event selection and a program selection decision, where with a program selection decision, there's probably less time imperative about it, and therefore when you have a policy, an appeal policy that gives an athlete 3 days to challenge or think, even to start to think about, never mind challenge and raise an appeal, that feels a difficult place for an athlete to be. And particularly if we, as an organisation, we want to reach out and provide them with some professional support through sports resolutions. But I do acknowledge with games or event selection, there's a whole different dimension to it in terms of time. So I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of what's reasonable in that space.
Yeah, it's not. I think you're right that it's difficult, and sometimes it just has to be done urgently, which is another reason why writing in a proper appeal procedure is better than leaving things to the High Court. I don't think it being quick means it has to be unfair. I think the key thing is people knowing in advance what the deal is, and making it clear in the procedure that the appeal may have to take place very quickly, so that athletes know that. Telling athletes, because they may not read the whole selection policy, telling athletes in advance, if you might want to appeal, we're going to have to move very, very fast on that, and the athletes will understand why. I don't think there is authoritative guidance on what is a fair period of time and what isn't. I just think you've got to use common sense. And if the athlete needs an extra 12 or 24 hours to put their appeal brief or submissions together, and that doesn't jeopardize selection for the games, then they should be given that time. And likewise, the governing body should take the time they need. So it's not ideal, but I think this is where arbitration and the use of panels organised separately from the courts, and for example by people like Sport Resolutions, really comes into its own. And I've done many of these hearings, and not once has the governing body or the athlete come away thinking, I was rushed there, that wasn't fair, we didn't get a fair process. If it's handled well and people behaving sensibly and not trying to be oppressive, then I think it should be fine. As you say, there are cases where you can take longer, and I've been involved in world class program challenges where you can take a bit more time, and I think that's sensible in that situation as well.
And there's a great question, a really relevant question come in from one of the lawyers. It says it's a legal question. If an NGB selected an athlete for Tokyo 2020 but didn't nominate to the NOC before COVID-19, is there any legal right of the athlete to protect the athlete's chance of being selected and nominated to the NOC in the UK?
Listen, is there a risk of legal challenge? Yes. Is there a risk of the legal challenge succeeding? Yes, because there always is at least a small risk, and sensible lawyers will never tell you that you're nailed on. But the selection policy should hopefully say that it can be changed if the circumstances justify it. If your selection policy doesn't say that, then it's probably implied, and make sure you include it in any future policies you draft. And my view is that tribunals, if it were to go to appeal or the High Court, that there would be recognition that this is not what the selection policy was anticipating. If someone has been selected already, then I'm assuming here that they've been selected for Tokyo 2020, whereas we're now talking about selection for something different, which is Tokyo 2021. And I think it will be difficult for athletes, unless they've been told this will hold for 2021. I think it will be difficult for athletes simply to say, you picked me for 2020 under the policy for 2020. That is binding for 2021. I think the likelihood is that appeal panels and courts will recognize that this is not what anyone envisaged when the selection decision was made. Now, clearly, it will vary hugely depending on the circumstances, and most likely there will be sometimes private conversations that no doubt athletes will want to rely on as well. I was asked to repeat something. Someone's asked me to repeat why I've said that an appeal policy shouldn't just say that the grounds of appeal are limited to not following the selection policy. And the reason I've said that is because, in my view, the law is that you can challenge on other grounds too, including one, that the approach taken was not reasonable or rational, and two, that there was a material factual error. In my view, anyone arguing that those aren't available grounds of challenge is not likely to be successful. And so it's just not sensible to say something different in the selection policy. It tries to shut down athletes' grounds when actually athletes' grounds are broader than that. And it also involves the governing body kidding itself about what the real test is. And I've litigated these policies before, and the first thing that happens in the hearing is the chairman or judge saying, "I'm sure you're not really saying, are you, governing body, that it's not open to challenge to the athlete to challenge if you're on the grounds that your decision's unreasonable?" And immediately the governing body says, we accept that. So saying something differently in the selection policy, in my view, isn't wise. Sam,
Daniel, there's quite a few questions, Daniel, around your. You talked about minutes, yes. and you talked about the accusation that you might well have manipulated your minutes because they were so detailed. But there's a few questions around what's the legality around recording selection meetings using a video, and how are they then used in appeals?
Listen, there are all sorts of different ways of doing this. Some may well engage data protection issues and the like, which are somewhat outside the scope of this discussion. But listen, I don't think it's necessary to video the selection meeting. I think that could make things slightly artificial and could slightly stifle the genuine debate in the selection meeting, which I think should be encouraged. You can always tape record them. That's a bit more, it's a bit less in your face and might not impede discussion. Should it be a transcript? Should it be a sort of more conventional minute? It can be either. I think what matters is that it's detailed. And listen, yes, that will inevitably result in comments to the effect that there are some words, that some athletes may appeal on the grounds that there's an unfortunate choice of words at one point. Well, if it really is just an unfortunate choice of words rather than signaling some deeper inappropriate approach to the selection process, then it's not going to result in a successful appeal. It might result in a bit of discomfort in an appeal hearing, but it's better that way than having minutes that are very, very summary form that result in little transparency and an appeal hearing where maybe you're even having to put forward people as witnesses, and they're cross-examined on what happened at the selection meeting. I mean, that I have been involved in those cases, and that's far less desirable from a governing body perspective than it is having a full set of minutes or a transcript and just putting it out there. And if it gets criticised, it gets criticised, and you deal with the criticisms.
Do you think, Dan, the fact we're probably likely to see much selection activity happening over virtual means, Zoom, Teams, does that change things? Do you think, I mean, obviously we can make recordings of those meetings?
Yeah, if it helps to produce a good minute and then record it, make sure people know if they're being recorded. I don't think it should change much. Otherwise, maybe it makes things easier to record, but I don't think it should change the core principles at all, really. And if anything, because people aren't in the same room, I think it's all the more important to be thorough and to go over it all. And my experience, for example, in court hearings is that what is court hearings over video is that the written word acquires greater importance and it's more difficult to communicate effectively orally. So, you know, make sure it's thoroughly done and thoroughly written down. Right, where should we go next, Sam? Let's have a look.
Sorry,
we did have appropriate legal training on the selection panel. I'd be interested in your views on this, Sam. I mean, how much does it, and there was also a question about whether that creates problems of privilege, but from an athlete's perspective, does it make much difference to them if there's a lawyer on the panel, on the selection panel, not the appeal panel, the selection panel?
I think it depends on, and again, each NGB is different in its structure, and some have in-house legal staff, others are buying in that resource. So I think it goes back to your point about being transparent about who's on there and their interests. I think generally athletes respect that legal presence and that oversight. So I've certainly not, from my experience, had an athlete question in terms of the composition, the legal presence. If anything, they've seen it as a positive.
Yeah. Listen, I generally think it's sensible. I can appreciate that it may give rise to issues of privilege and whether the advice given is privileged. I mean, two thoughts on that. One, if the person is coming to it fresh, which in my view they should be, it shouldn't be, for example, the established legal advisor to the governing body, because that defeats the point of having that person being fairly independent. If they're coming to it fresh, that helps and reduces concern. And also, the point of this is to ensure that it's done properly and give everyone comfort it's done properly. So I would have thought that the selection panel, in most cases, may be prepared to waive privilege over what the legal advisor might be saying, and just to include it in the minutes. It should be quite isolated advice. There shouldn't be advice before and after, typically. So just see what the legal advisor said, and if you would expect the selection panel to adhere to what the legal advisor is saying. If in fact the legal advisor said, well, I would recommend here that you approach things this way, and the selection panel has then ignored that, then I would have thought that would be a matter of serious concern. So I don't see, in the typical case, privilege being an issue, and I think it doesn't do any harm. At the very least, it doesn't do any harm, and it's not always easy for selection panels who are so close to the data, so close to the facts, so close to the performance issues, to stand back and apply the policy correctly, and that's where someone like that can be very helpful.
I think the only point I'd throw back really, and interested in your thoughts, is that obviously that LIGAD is a non-voting member, but we know that some sports have an internal first round of appeal, which in some sports involves potentially the same LIGAD. And I just wonder again whether there is a perception, real or otherwise, by an athlete that's appropriate, that the same legal advisor is involved in deciding whether or not that appeal case has met the threshold.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I've not seen that before myself, but which is, and if I had, I'd been concerned. I have to say. I mean, the appeal process should be independent from the get-go. Yes, the administration and getting up and running mechanically may involve people from the governing body, but any substantive decision about the validity of the appeal should not be connected to or determined by someone who's been involved in the selection process. And in my view, that would include, in that example, the LIGAD, who was involved in the selection panel, whether they're voting or non-voting or whatever, or independent or an existing advisor. That strikes me as wrong in principle, and I don't think it would be looked upon well by the courts. I would only add on the appeal point that I have seen a two-stage approach taken before, where you have someone first effectively deciding whether the appeal raises a case to answer or not. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical of that approach, because I tend to find that it's not really a shortcut. You tend to end up with a disgruntled athlete if there's a decision of no case to answer, because they don't feel that they've really had their day in court, and it just takes up more time. So, unless you're expecting many appeals, I personally would just say just have one stage going straight to the main substantive appeal and deal with it that way. It may feel more uncomfortable and for the governing body, and it may feel nice to have that security blanket of the first threshold, but in my experience, it doesn't achieve very much, and can be self-defeating. I want to raise one of these questions, which is about how this compares with selection in other sports. So the question is, the selection of players for the Rugby World Cup, for example, has no apparent published selection process or appeal. Is that the way forward? And how would we get selection process for the Olympics and Paralympics, if so? I always find this fascinating, because as the question suggests, for football and rugby, there's basically no published selection process or appeal system, which I know then makes certain performance directors think that they shouldn't be any different. It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, that is where all sports have come from, and I personally like to think that so far as Olympic and Paralympic sports and others have moved away from that and have gone to a much more transparent process, that is better for everybody. The difficulty with going back to the old style is that the culture has changed now, and people's expectations have changed. And whilst in football, people might be prepared to accept that it's you get called up or you don't, and that's it. And in rugby, the same. That's not what people now expect in the Olympic and Paralympic sports. And I can't see us going back to the old system anytime soon, especially given the amount of public money that is used, although I appreciate that there is public money in football and rugby as well. Sam, what do you think about this?
I mean, I think I'd like to pick up your point about societal changes. I think we've got generations coming behind most of us that, and young people who I think would see that as a really retrospective step back. I think we've got generations again coming behind us who will be, more demanding, and rightly so. So for me, I think we've got to move forward. I think. And not go back to that previous way of doing things.
There's a discrete question here, which is that Sam's mentioned guidance from UK Sport, etc., about selection procedures, and does similar guidance exist in relation to the role of a selector? And I think the answer is yes, in the sense that there is guidance about how selectors should go about their role in the UK Sport guidance that Sam mentioned. I actually reread it this morning, and there is a section on how selectors should go about doing their job. So I think that hopefully answers that one. There have been a couple of questions about third parties in selection appeals, which maybe we have that one and maybe one more, and then round up. But the question is really, how do you deal with third parties? Athletes, for example, who aren't appealing, but who have been selected or who stand to be affected if an appeal is successful. And I think this is difficult. Is it, for example, how do you deal with that other athlete? And should the selection panel be entitled then to just, or rather the appeal panel be entitled to say, well, I'm not picking you after all, it's going to be this person who's going to be picked who's successfully appealed. I mean, from a legal perspective, and I think there was a lot of, Sam will have no doubt something to add here. From a legal perspective, I think you do need to think about third party rights in the appeal. And there are a number of different ways of doing that, but where I've come out now when I advise on this is you should notify if there is an athlete whose selection is at risk because of the appeal. They should be informed of the fact of the appeal and given an opportunity to participate should they wish to do so. They shouldn't be forced to participate. You don't need to badger them about it. I think you need to be aware, if you're a governing body, of their mental state. And you can make all of this discretionary, so it can be, you can make it a matter for the governing body whether you notify them. If, for example, you know that this athlete is in a very delicate mental state, and it would make them extremely anxious to know that there's been an appeal that threatens their place, then you might not want to notify them. But I think having the option to do so, if considered appropriate, is important. Having the option for them, if they are notified, to participate is important. In most cases, they choose not to participate, in my experience, and they let the governing body do the running and defend the decision. So it's a difficult area, it's a sensitive area, and I think it's one where the individual characteristics of the other athlete need to be borne in mind on a case-by-case basis. I think it remains the case that in those circumstances, if the appeal panel thought the existing decision could not stand, that typically, unless it was conceded that by the governing body that this must inevitably mean that the other athlete must get selected, then normally it does have to be remitted back to the selection panel to reconsider. Because usually the issue is not that the decision is completely wrong, it's that there's been a flaw in the decision. And that what is required is for that flaw to be cured. And the selection panel then needs to decide, having cured that flaw, who do I want to pick now? And that doesn't necessarily mean that the appealing athlete will be selected. It means that the process now needs to be a fair one. What's your view on third-party athletes?
I think that a consideration needs to be given to the scale of the impact on that third party. And if we're talking about there may well be inevitable change in somebody going to the games, then that level of that scale of that impact is huge. So for me, there's a real consideration given that they may well need to be told, and it links back to my piece around this rush to announce as well. So I think that all needs to be woven in, and if a sport chooses to tell a third party, then again that support blanket needs to be wrapped, that support network needs to be wrapped around that other athlete as well during that whole period of uncertainty. But I do think it needs to be considered, and as you said, there's probably no hard and fast right or wrong. I think it will be in an individual assessment as to what that impact might well be.
There's been a comment in the Q&A made, which is I completely agree with, which is one risk governing bodies need to guard against in all of this is a second appeal, and that is a reason to think about involving the other athlete, and you just need to now you need to manage risk, because what you can't have from a governing body perspective, especially in an urgent situation, is appeal after appeal after appeal. It has happened before. It's toxic for a variety of reasons, and whatever approach you take, have in mind that you want this appeal to be the only one that arises, and you want everyone to be satisfied with the fairness of the process after this appeal. Should we take one more, Sam, and then wrap up?
So we've had a couple of questions around, I think I did cover it, but we can just go over again about the costs, our views on requiring athletes to cover appeal costs. I mean, I talked about the UK Sport BOA BPA guidance, which in there, I think the wording is that they don't recommend putting a charge to the athlete. We know sports do. I think BAC, we take a position where there should be, limited, if no barriers to an athlete wanting to raise an appeal. In some cases, it's a fairly nugatory charge, but in some sports, it's significant. And I think to bear in mind that if you're talking about an athlete and it's a deselection from programme, they've only got 3 months of funding ahead of them. So to levy a charge of, in some cases, near £1,000, I think does act as a significant barrier, and I'm one that I would add real caution to.
I agree. I mean, I don't have a problem in principle with a small charge that's just enough to stop real time wasters, whether it's, I don't know, 150, 250 pounds maybe. But I think beyond that, it can start to become more than just a filter for time wasters, and can become more problematic. And in any case, I think that should be the limit of, it should be clear that that's the limit of the athlete's exposure to cost, and they should get their money back if their appeal succeeds.
And I think it also links. I think it also links down to the point that I made, that if we work in this proactive space in terms of educating our athletes, supporting them with appropriate professional advice, and those people have an honesty to the athlete and the system in terms of making sure that these appeals are valid. That the athlete has an understanding about whether or not the strength of that appeal, and that we don't just go through the process for the sake of it, and we consider how we're going to leave the athlete at the end. Then as I could say, if we've given them that support and advice at the beginning, maybe, and again in my experience, is that athletes, they know that the right decision has been made, and they they get to the point where they accept it and don't lodge an appeal. So I think, rather than putting that barrier, that monetary barrier up, take a step back, give them the right knowledge, skills and support to know whether or not they have a valid appeal, and then they're not wasting their money.
I agree. I just add to that, governing bodies can, and in my view, should direct athletes to try and get lawyers on board. And Sport Resolutions, amongst others, has people who will help, including often on a pro bono basis. And that may sound suicidal. Go and get them tooled up, tell them to get tooled up with really excited lawyers who want to become great sports lawyers, or whatever it is, or who are great sports lawyers. But it's much better for the process. The lawyers, if they're in any way competent, will know the limits of the process, will know what's a good point, what's a bad point, will act as a buffer with the athlete, and you will get a process that runs smoothly, rather than being barraged by emails from people who don't understand the arguments that are available to them and those that aren't. So, all of those things, again, it's good for the athlete, it's good for the governing body. The last, just one quick point I can pick off quickly is, can you have age as a selection criteria without falling foul of the Equality Act? The simple answer to that is yes, so long as the use of age as a factor is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate objective, which is all very vague, but it means basically that it's only if it's justified by reference to what you're trying to achieve. So that is a question that's fairly straightforward to answer. I think we're now running out of time. Am I right, Sam?
Yeah, I think we've answered the majority of questions. So if I can take an opportunity just to close, I would like to thank Richard and the team at Sports Resolutions UK for allowing Dan and I to do this webinar today. It was an idea that Richard and his team and I talked about, I think, at the back end of last year and beginning of this year, and unfortunately COVID and the lockdown scuppered our plan for this, which I think was in the sort of end of March. So I'm really grateful that we've managed to resurrect it. Obviously the delayed, at that point we didn't even know we were going to have a delayed postponed games. So it feels actually, it's become much more relevant, and I hope that what we have shared with you today is incredibly relevant to the journeys that everybody's going on over the next weeks and months ahead. So in bringing this presentation to a conclusion, I thank you for your virtual participation. The questions have been great, and certainly from a BAC perspective have given us much to think about and take forward and weave into our support mechanism and structure that we give to our athletes. So thank you very much indeed, and I wish you all good health in the future. Thank you.